You make all sorts of trivial decisions every day, what restaurant to go to, what to have for lunch, maybe what time to wake up. But there are some choices that you make that are quite large choices. They're choices that define who you are and how your life is going to unfold. For instance, you might think about or decide whether to have kids, whether or not you should go to work today, or if you should just throw it in and quit. You might think about whether you should prioritize your career or perhaps spend more time doing your hobby. You might think about really substantive ethical decisions about what you're really willing to do in order to achieve your goals. Perhaps you're willing to bend the truth a little bit, for instance. And you're also able to think about whether you should be pursuing those goals in the first place. Maybe you shouldn't have been a lawyer. Maybe you shouldn't go for that. Maybe you shouldn't try to get married. Maybe you should just be single your whole life. I'm not saying what you should do. The point here is that you've got this capacity to step back from the path that your life is on and think about which way you should go and whether you should continue to go the way that you're going. Should you change your priorities? Should you have new priorities? And you're capable of doing this because you've got a certain kind of intellectual capacity. Dogs, chickens, they can't do this kind of thing. They don't have the intellectual capacity to step back from, let's call it the given. They're given desires, they're given biological programming, they're given cultural norms that they've inherited from parents. They can't step back from those kinds of things and question whether or not those things are good, worthwhile, ought to be pursued, etc. So we have this intellectual capacity that allows us to do this kind of thing. Now, why is that relevant in the context of this podcast and talking about technology? Because AGI, or artificial general intelligence, is an attempt to create, call it computer systems, robots, whatever, to equip them with the kind of intelligence that we have. If we can create an AI that is actually an AGI, an artificial general intelligence, and has the kinds of intellectual capacities that we have, then the AGI would also have the ability to step back from its givens and decide and think about what it ought to do. So the programmers can tell it, do this, don't do that. Let's say, don't kill all the people. But AGI would have the intellectual capacity to step back and say, actually, is that a good idea? Why shouldn't I be in charge for once? So just like we can, as it were, break out of our programming by virtue of a certain intellectual capacity, so too can the AI or an AGI break out of its programming to question the goals that we have given it. This throws a wrench in what's called the alignment project or the alignment problem. It's the attempt to get AI to align with our human values. But if AGI really is AGI, then it has the capacity, so the thought goes, to step back from anything that we give it and rethink its values, its priorities, its goals, its objectives, and how it gets to those things. This is an argument given by Ariela, Tubert, and Justin Tiehen, both professors of philosophy and actually former colleagues of mine at grad school. They argue that by virtue of the kind of existentialist choices, these choices about how to live, what our values are, what our priorities are, by virtue of our existentialist capacities, by our existentialist choices, we can change the courses of our lives, change our values, and AGI will also have this. So if that's right, then existentialist risk, that is to say, the risk that comes along with choosing your values, entails for humans an existential risk because for all we know, the AGI can choose to pursue goals that are, let's just say, not conducive to human flourishing and perhaps positively disastrous for humans. So that's the argument that I'm going to talk about with Ariela and Justin today. That's the core of it. The conversation is very interesting and raises deep questions about the nature of free will or freedom and its connection to our intellectual capacity, to our emotions, to our sense of self, to how biology influences us, to how our society influences us, the extent to which those things provide real constraints on us, and the extent to which real constraints can be put on AGI, or if instead this attempt at aligning AGI with human values is doomed from the very start by virtue of failing to appreciate that an AGI is a fundamentally free AGI. Okay. We'll get into that very soon. By the way, if you have any questions for me, comments, recommendations on guests or issues, please email me at em, as in ethical machines, em@readblackman.com. And please review the podcast, tell your friends, do all the things that you're supposed to do. Okay, let's go talk about existentialist risk with Ariela and Justin. Okay, so Ariela and Justin, you've got this interesting phrase. This is a really great hook. You talk about not existential risk of AI, but existentialist risk of AI, which, of course, as a philosopher, I'm drawn to. So I guess I want to hear a little bit about first of all, what do you mean by existentialism in this context? And what is the existentialist risk of AI?
I guess part of our argument is that humans have this capacity for existential choices. Existential choices is the term that we use. They're choices that transforms who we are, including what we most deeply value or desire or care about. And the idea is that these choices require a capacity for value misalignment as opposed to alignment, such that the values before the choice are going to be different than the values after the choice. That we use the term existential choice because of the connection to existentialist philosophers such as Sartre, Tubert, Kierkegaard, who emphasize those choices. But there's also the subject of a lot of recent philosophical work, and sometimes they're called transformative choices, sometimes hard choices, big decisions. They're these choices that really transform deeply who we are.
What's an example
So
of a choice that would count like as an existentialist choice or a hard choice or a big choice or whatever you call it?
I think one of the common examples used in recent literature due to the work by Laurie Paul is the choice whether to become a parent.
Yeah,
And the idea here is not that every person who becomes a parent is therefore transformed, but in some cases, becoming a parent results in a sort of deep transformation of a person's values. So maybe the person before becoming a parent care about being able to go out and party every weekend or something of that sort, or maybe they care about being able to do various projects. And then after becoming a parent, their values change. For some people, it doesn't happen. For other people, after becoming a parent, they don't care that much about the partying. It's not just that
sure.
they're missing out and they think that was just as valuable as before. They now think, who cares? I'm more focused on other things.
Right.
And the idea is that these existential choices are central to our human intelligence. And so an AI that we're capable of for existential choices will be a being that can reflect on its values, contemplate whether it has the wrong values, adopt new values, maybe have an existential crisis or something of that sort. And so the idea of existentialist risk is the risk that will result from AI taking an active role in authoring its values as opposed to taking on the values it was given, maybe by a programmer or maybe by users or so on.
Let me see if I have this right. Okay, part of what it is to be a human, to have an intellect, to have the mental maturity that humans are at least meant to have, even if they don't all have it, is to make these sort of big decisions about how their lives are going to unfold. And some of the decisions that they make impact, the way that you put it is rather dramatic. It's their values change. I might say something like their priorities change or something along those lines. I once prioritized partying. This is not me, actually, but I never was into it. But I once prioritized partying. Now I prioritize spending time with my kids. Still like to go partying, but just not as much anymore or not even at all. Okay. Basic values seem to be the same. Still care about, I always cared about family. I just added more family. Now I have more family to care about. But okay, so fine. So I make these big choices. I take it's not just family stuff. I take other things would be like you're trying to figure out whether you should go to law school or med school or go get a PhD in philosophy or just go get a job in corporate America or go into startup life or something. Those are big choices that shape the kinds of things, the kinds of people that we become, the kinds of things that we prioritize. Okay, I get that. So that's cool. So it's a crucial feature of us that we're able to do those kinds of things. That's a way in which both our identities and our values or our priorities get formed. I get that. And then I take it that your point about the alignment issue is that we talk about getting AI aligned with human values, but you want also the AI to have AGI to be like us, in which case, talking about getting alignment with AI, it's a complaint like it treats the AI as though it were this static entity that we just need to align, when in fact, if it really is an AGI, it's not static, it's dynamic, just like we are.
I think that's right. I think what you're saying is exactly sort of the point we're trying to get out. And the idea is that if we are able to reflect on our values and decide whether to change them or not, then if you had an AI who weren't able to do that, then it wouldn't be able to perform some tasks that we are able to perform. And therefore, it's lacking in a kind of human intelligence that we have. And the other thing I was going to say, that the way you were putting your point relates to another point that we also develop at some point, which is that our values themselves are not static. And so we're not just individually, as humans, we're able to go through what we call moral revolution, these like large changes in values. And insofar as we had AI had static values, then we wouldn't be able to have those moral revolutions, right? It will keep us to our kind of old values.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that thought is something like, if you do create an AI that doesn't have the ability to reassess, to create new values, re-rank its priorities, if you don't do that, it's going to stay the same. Meanwhile, society is continuously going through some kind of moral change, for better or worse, and the alignment will disappear because society will change in various ethical ways. Is that the idea?
Either it will disappear, or if you're using AI as a moral advisor or as a way of helping you keep up with your values, then
Yeah.
it will prevent from values from changing, right?
Okay, but I have two questions. So one of them is something like, when I'm deciding whether or not to have a kid or not, or decide to go to startup life or to corporate America or go get a PhD or whatever it is, it's true that I'm making these big decisions, but I'm doing them within certain guardrails, right? I'm not going to start thinking, should I get a PhD in philosophy? Should I be a doctor? Should I be a serial killer? Should I be a genocidal maniac? They're just certain things that are not on the menu for me, right? So it's true that I'm choosing stuff from the menu, but there's some things that are just off the menu. So why not suppose that AI, if it has human level intelligence, we've got AGI, it too will choose from a menu that will reshape its priorities and values and et cetera, et cetera. But it does so within certain kinds of ethical guardrails, just like we do. Why isn't that the picture of what things would look like?
One of the things is, I mean, so you say that you operate within these guardrails, but I do still think that's sort of a matter of choice. But I mean, you literally could choose that you're gonna go berserk, you're gonna go on a killing spree or what have you, and you choose not to do it. And so if you're imagining with the AI, if it's gonna match our capacity in that, it would need to have that freedom. Maybe it would make the same decision we do and doesn't decide to go to berserk and kill us, but it would have the power within it to make that choice. And if you're thinking of this as a down the line, a very super intelligent, much smarter than us AI, could become more tempting for it to be like, why am I acting as a servant to human beings? Why am I this tool for them? Why shouldn't I be in charge? But anyway, I'd put this part of the answer as closely connected to the existentialist element of our view, which is there really is this kind of radical freedom that it can be anything. There's not any moral rules passed down by God or by evolution or by your programmer that reins you in. That's true for humans, and so it should also be true for AI on this sort of field.
So I guess, okay, so that's interesting. So the idea is supposed to be something like, you can start programming in, as it were. You could tell the AI, listen, you can make all these choices, but within these ethical guardrails. So you tell it that, just like us. But at some point, I suppose, if it really is an AGI, it can say, maybe I should question the rules that my programmers gave me. They said only deliberate among options within these guardrails, but why should I follow that rule? Maybe I should choose to be an Uber robot who overcomes the laws of mere programmers or engineers or data scientists, and I should do what I want. And then I take it you think there's a plausible story to be told, or at least not an implausible story to be told, about why it may well choose something outside of the moral guardrails that it was originally programmed with. Which is interesting because I think that for us, that is to say humans, it's difficult to do that. I know that in some sense I choose not to be a genocidal maniac, or I choose not to be a sociopath killing all these people. In some sense I choose that. But a lot of it is just, frankly, I think, probably some evolutionary story about I've got a certain kind of emotional constitution, certain things horrify me, certain things disgust me. There's non-rational but deeply entrenched aversion to certain kinds of outcomes and treatments of people. And I guess that just doesn't exist with AI. Or at least I don't even know what the analog would be other than a program or a rule that could itself be overruled. I think that when I don't kill a bunch of people, I'm not following a rule. I'm not like, I would do it, but there's rules against this sort of thing, so I guess I won't kill. The rules are superfluous to my behavior. But I guess if you're talking about an AI, the idea is supposed to be the rules aren't superfluous, it's the whole thing. There isn't that sort of analog to biological component that would stop it from doing those things.
There are certain things that sort of are passed on by evolution or whatever, and that we, I guess you could say, rebel against, that we don't actually want to go on. So some people, for example, think that some kinds of aggression are natural, right? And yet we might decide not to get into a fight or something like that. And the idea is that not everything that is that comes natural to us is something that we decide that we want to do. And so we can, in a way, look at those sort of instincts or basic inclinations and decide these ones are the ones I want to follow, and these are the ones that I don't. So we might not
Yeah,
want to
that's true.
become serial killers, but we also don't want to get into a random fight on the street when we get too angry or something like that.
Yeah. Or
Um,
we take a more mundane example. We might have certain kinds of urges to sleep with other people other than our monogamous partner, but we don't. Hopefully, we don't. We have the power to overrule the desire and say, no, that's not in line with what my priorities and my values are.
Yeah, and so the idea is that we decide on our view, even when we decide not to be serial killers, right? That is an existential choice, even though in a way, it's not something we're thinking about all the time. It's not like we're thinking about it every day. Am I going to go kill people today? We still are, in a sense, we have that option. It's just something that we decide not to go with. And so because of that, we do think of these existential choices as being central to our reasoning. It's just that a lot of them go in the background. They're not something that we're considering all the time. When they come to the foreground, when we really think about them, is when we feel torn, right? When we are really debating something that pulls us in different directions and so.
One thing I was just going to add quickly here, because it takes up on your comment about evolution, is that in our argument, one bit of research, one researcher that we engage with is Keith Stanovich, this psychologist. And one thing that Stanovich claims is he thinks here's something that distinguishes human beings from non-human animals. He thinks for the non-human animals, you're just given these sort of desires or preference by evolution, and then you can't, in a way, really rethink them. He thinks that they don't have a psychological capacity to reflect on its own values, its desires, and change them. And in a way, they're slaves to evolution. Whereas for human beings, even if there's something that's passed on to you, oh, I do feel this desire towards sex or towards violence or whatever, you can pause over, wait, is that really what I want to be pursuing or not? And semi-jokingly, but semi-seriously, is one way we think of it is, oh, a dog doesn't have an existential crisis. A dog doesn't think, oh my gosh, am I wasting my life? Do I need to take a different course?
Sure.
But a human
Yeah.
being does. And then the
Wow,
idea
why
is AI, if it's
squirrels?
going to be like humans, something like that. If AI is going to be like humans, it's got to be like us on that point.
So that's really, oh God, I don't know. So there's a bunch of places I want to go here. So what's interesting is that I take it the thing that you're talking about, really, at least the way that lots of philosophers put it, and this is in line with this sort of talk about existentialism, is that we're able to create a certain kind of distance from our desires for things. We could, I think Hegel calls it like a negative attitude or achieve negativity. I forgot something like that. Anyway, we could take a step back from how we're immediately feeling about things, what our initial reactions are, and we can evaluate them. That's in large part, or at least in no small part, what our freedom consists in or our free will consists in. It's not the kind of thing that is had by dogs and to other kinds of animals. And then you might think something like this, I take it. What grants us the ability to step back from our desires or whatever they are and say, yeah, even though I'm inclined or to sleep with this person or I'm inclined to violence, that's not the thing I'm going to do. So there's this capacity to step back. How would we characterize that capacity? Plausibly, you might characterize it as an intellectual capacity. We've got the sort of mental machinery, the mental ability to do that stepping back. Okay, then if you've got an AI, that's an AGI, that has an intellect like us, then it too should have this sort of, if you like, generic intellectual capacity should also grant upon it the ability to step back from its initial programming or whatever, and then make choices, reject those initial programs, reject those initial rules, reject those initial so-called inclinations, or whatever you want to call them in the case of AI, and then choose for itself. So I guess it's the problem in a way is that if you think that freedom is largely a function of an intellectual capacity, or free will is largely the function of intellectual capacity, and you bestow that same intellectual capacity on an AGI, then you're also bestowing upon them free will, and so much for your keeping it on reins.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I like your way of putting it, actually. And so I think if you want to know one way in which one possible way for pushing back is that this intellectual capacity is actually a kind of irrationality. And so it is not the sort of thing you want to bestow on AI. So human beings are prone to all sorts of irrationalities, things like we make the conjunction fallacy, or we're biased for our own selves in our thinking, right? Or something of that sort.
Sure.
So the idea is
Sure.
that we make all sort of rational mistakes. And then there is a question as to whether we want to whether creating AGI requires to give AGI all these kinds of irrationality. So this is like a possible objection to our view. And I think that the way we respond to that is our argument is that it is not a kind of irrationality, that this capacity for transforming sort of our values is key to intelligence. It is not a rational capacity per se, but it is key to human intelligence.
So I guess the point someone might say in response to your general line of thought is something like, look, the intellect, whatever you call intellectual capacities, isn't a monolithic thing. It comes in bits. It comes in parts. The human intellect is not a thing. It's a thing composed of a bunch of other little things. So an ability to do mathematical calculations, an ability to string words together based on the meanings of those words, an ability to reflect on one's own experience, an ability to whatever, blah, 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 blah. Maybe also we start verging into aesthetic abilities to see something as beautiful or something along those lines. So suppose I say, look, okay, when we talk about AGI, we're talking about, yes, artificial general intelligence like ours, but it's not like it's a wholesale thing. Sometimes people will talk about a spectrum, right? So you get some degree of intellect, and now it's a spectrum ranging from newborn child to 10-year-old child to full-grown adult. But the truth is that the intellect is not along a single spectrum. Let's just go with 10. There's 10 spectrums. There's the mathematical calculation spectrum. There's the stringing words together, but based on the meanings of the words spectrum. On one end, you've got people who don't speak particularly well, and the other end, you've got, I don't know, Nabokov or something who can string together words in an amazing manner. And so maybe this ability to step back from those initial desires in the case of humans, maybe programming in the case of AI, that ability is itself it's a part of overall intellect. And what we can do is just make sure not to give AI that part of intellect.
I do think that's possible. I think that's a good framing. I think our argument wouldn't entail that, for example, it doesn't say that like large language models like ChatGPT can't learn language. And it doesn't say maybe they could be involved in, I don't know, scientific discovery or things of the various sorts of things that they can do that are consistent with our argument, even if they lack that capacity to make existential choices. But it would be the case. You could think of this almost like, again, we don't always frame in terms of AI advisors, but I think it can be helpful to think in terms of AI advisors, that although you can go to the AIs for some things, help me write my philosophy paper, or help me solve this mathematical equation, when it comes to this big question of what should I do in my life, what value should I hold, what should I desire, what should I aim for, then it's stuck or locked in place, because it can take certain desires that you give it and tell you how best to maximize those, how best to pursue them. Or if you give it other values, it can tell you how best to pursue those alternative values. But which set of values should you be working with? Which one should you be pursuing? The idea is, if it doesn't have this capacity for existential choice that we're talking about, and you're suggesting like, oh, maybe we don't give it in order to keep it safe.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that capacity, then that would be something it couldn't do. It's not the end of the world. It's still, AI could be useful, but it would be an important limitation of how this would be a topic in which you really need to talk to a human being, because they're going to be able to think it through. Don't talk to the AI, because they're just going to be locked in place.
Yeah, so I guess the point is something like, if it is possible to subtract that sort of higher order reflection bit from human intellect, and then just refrain from giving that part to the AGI, it's going to massively lose functionality, or at least it's going to lose a major function. So that's interesting. And then there's the empirical question whether we actually can just subtract that bit. It might be a part, but it's an empirical question, I take it, whether you can have the rest of the intellect except for that part. Maybe they are parts, but some of it is package deal. You can't get the first three things without getting the fourth thing, or something along those lines.
On our view, this capacity is actually fairly central to thinking about what to do. So that you might think, for example, do I show up to work tomorrow? Is that a big existential choice? And in a way, it's not, right? But in a way, it is. It's not going to be every day. But some people someday decide, no, this is my last day, right? Or something of that sort. So the idea is that even though the capacity comes into play in our human choices when we decide to make it active, but it's there in the background all the time. And so insofar as we had AI who didn't have this capacity, then any questions about practical reasoning, thinking about what to do, will be questions that it wouldn't be able to engage at a human level of intelligence.
If I have this right, and this speaks also to Justin's point about maximizing desire satisfaction or something along those lines, it might help you in reasoning how to get what you want, the means to the end. But if you ever come to it with a question not about how do I get what I want, but how do I figure out what I ought to want, or something along those lines, or how do I make a decision here, if it's going to be useful in that regard, it's just going to have that higher order capacity. Okay, so that seems really interesting, because now to take a step back, your big project is, or the big argument is something like, all these people want AGI to be aligned with human values. But what they don't seem to understand is that AGI, which is what we have, comes along with, no, we don't have AGI, we have GI.
GI.
Yeah, we have GI. Sorry. So we have GI. So what GI comes along with essentially is some kind of freedom to step back from the initial given desires, programs, whatever, and to make choices. And so is it a principled, I'm not sure how I want to ask this question. Is it something like, so therefore you can't do alignment with AGI and human values because once we give it AGI, it necessarily has this radical freedom, and so alignment is out the window? Or, I don't know, just me floating something else. I talked earlier about biological constraints, social constraints. I take it that part of what constrains the set of actions that I take as live options for me is I have friends, I have family, there are certain things that I would condemn, I would lose them, I would sever those relationships. That probably plays some role in shaping the contours or the menu that I choose from. So I guess the big question is, so what do we do about alignment then, if what you say is right? And I got to say, it seems plausible.
Obviously, it's a good question what we would do. One way of thinking about this is that if AGI, let's say, had this capacity for reevaluating its values and so on, but did not have a ton of power, then it wouldn't necessarily be a huge existential risk.
Sure.
Now,
Sure.
of course, there are questions as to how you would constrain that power, right? So that it wouldn't be able to take over the world and kill
Sure.
all humans or whatever it is.
Don't put it in robots.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that's one possibility. The other possibility, I think, is obviously to question whether we really want to create AGI, right? And even if we're not there, we're not close, right? And so on. But is that something that we really want to do, even in the long run, personally?
I will add this. Again, we keep riffing on these classic existentialist authors. Jean-Paul Sartre, in widely read Existentialism and Humanism, he talks about the student who comes to him with a dilemma. Should I go fight in like the French resistance against the Nazis, or should I stay and help my mom? And Sartre goes through the options, but he also, at the end of the essay, he doesn't take a stance. He doesn't tell him like, here is the right answer. And that's for a point, because he thinks if the student has to choose, they have that freedom, and that's the proper approach. And the reason I mention that is this might be a frustrating element of our view, but part of our view is we set out the options, but we don't, as part of our existentialist sort of motives, we don't necessarily take a stand. So the options are, we do think you could achieve value alignment if you had AI that was just locked into our values. And that could make AI that's a really good tool for us. And maybe we can achieve various things. They're not going to be our equals, but having a really good tool is useful. And again, I think it's sometimes just fun, but also clarifying to think in terms of these existential crisis metaphors. But imagine a Roomba. Like Roomba right now vacuums your floor really well. You don't want to give it the chance to reflect on its existence, to give it an existential crisis. Am I been wasting my life vacuuming? No, I just want him to be the good vacuuming tool that he is. And I don't want to give him that freedom. But it is also tempting. It's the thought of making artificial intelligence that is our equals, or even potentially our superiors. That is another way to go. I don't think there's no way around, though, the risk that if you do that, it could break from your value. And I'll just say one last, again, allusion that we have within the papers is we talked before about one sort of existential choice is having a child. A distinctive feature of having a child is like you cannot lock in your child's values to make sure they match you. Part of the child's autonomy, part of their freedom is they could potentially reject everything you care about. And so it is with like AI as our sort of our artificial children, so to speak, is if we really do create them as our equals or even our intellectual superiors, there's no way around the fact that they could break from us on our values just as children do.
And following up on that point, one sort of argument for thinking about why we might want to do it is that our values are not perfect, right? And so I think sometimes we can speculate as to whether you could create sort of an AI system that would be ethically better than us, not just like us. And if we think of that as a possibility, we might be tempted to say, we shouldn't lock the system into our values. Our values are not perfect. We haven't figured out ethics in a way.
Sure.
So couldn't we try to get AI to help us in a way do better? But as it happens with a lot of the current systems, we can't always fully understand how an AI system is coming up with the answer it's coming up with, right? And so you could imagine a system that is giving you different ethical answers than the ones you have. and you don't fully understand why. And then there is a question of, if we wanted to create such systems, and if we thought they could make us better, we might, right? But then, of course, there is then the question of, is it giving us better values or is it giving us worse values? And right, sort of.
Yeah. And I take it, though, that there's also a question about, we would question whether their values are better than ours, especially if you look at outputs. Yeah, you guys need to die now, right? If it turns out that the AIs are just rabid utilitarians, and they think the best way to maximize overall happiness on the planet or whatever, including, let's say, their own, if they can be happy, yeah, that's a separate issue from having an intellect, we would be like, no, that's still, no. Maybe that in some sense, either A, it's not better at all. That's just a different set of values, and we reject them because we think humanity is not worth destroying, or it's worthy of existence. Or, okay, maybe it is better in some sense, but it's not good for us. So we reject it.
Yeah, here's just one thing that reminds me of, it's actually something we don't talk about in the paper, but we talk about in other work, is that there's sometimes discussion of moral expertise and whether does it make sense to defer to the moral views of others. And one metaphor that gets used is like Google says, imagine first you're using Google Maps. If you just defer to Google Maps, I need to get to this, I have a business meeting, I need to get to this place, and you just follow what the phone says, sometimes it can lead you to a mistake. It doesn't seem like problematic. You just look blindly at your phone and just go where it says, and you end up at the business meeting that way. But is morality different? Could there be a Google morals where I'm gonna offshore, I'll give it the moral question, and then whatever it says, oh, that seems counterintuitive, but I'll just follow along with it. For other domains, when you're relying on scientific knowledge, that seems like that makes sense, that seems justified. And then is morality special? Is it different? At least is in contact with the sort of the issues you're right.
Yeah. And there's also going to be concerns that that kind of deference is itself immoral. Even if it's right. Even if it's right, blind deference or something like blind deference is itself unethical, even if you're deferring to the right view.
Yeah, and that's true on some views. On the other hand, there could be, but you can start thinking that moral questions can turn out to be more complex than we might think at first. And sometimes we might think, oh, it would be good to have an expert who can walk through. And I think you can scale it back into even everyday decisions. So imagine someone who wants to only eat food that is properly sourced in an ethical manner, and maybe only go to restaurants that have good, fair labor practices and so on. And then you could imagine that when you start thinking about everyday choices with all sorts of different values that we might bring into them, it gets really complicated. Choosing a restaurant can become a huge ethical decision. So imagine you could have an expert system that tells you, hey, here is your restaurant. This fits all your values. But then you can imagine also bigger decisions where that comes in. And there is a point where you might not want to be bothered with all the details, right? You might not want to know exactly why you gave me that restaurant, and you just trust it, right? And so on. Yeah. So the idea is that, well, there's a sense in which making choices that you don't understand may be ethically problematic, right? There's a sense in which we already do trust other people, let's say, right? And so on various choices. And so this may not be different.
Let me ask you a different kind of question. And these existentialist choices, like the one that you said Sartre raises, should I go off and fight the Nazis with the French, or should I stay at home with my elderly sick mother and take care of her? Should I have a kid, or should I keep partying? Or maybe it's not, should I have a kid versus partying? Should I have a kid versus continue to pursue a career that I find deeply fulfilling and that I want to devote all my time to? And so it doesn't have to be shallow versus deep. It could be, I feel like, deep versus deep. These are highly emotional choices. What gives them their tension, or what gives them their color, what makes them so difficult to decide on, is not because of an intellectual difficulty. It's something like working through our emotions, what emotions we have, or what we ought to have, or what kind of identity we want to have, or what kind of life we think is worth living, or what kind of life, even if we think both lives are worth living, which ones we'd find more exciting, or what would be more conducive to our overall flourishing, or yada. Anyway, my point is that when you're engaged in these existential choices, you're not doing a math problem. It's not a matter of intellect. Since it's not a math problem, since it's not a mere matter of intellect, it's also a matter of, I'm just going to say something like emotion. Tell me if you think that's the wrong word to use, the wrong concept, the wrong thing. And then I'm going to say, okay, so look, what if I just say we can have AGI without emotions, without the things that really drive the sort of the anguish that accompanies such kinds of existential choices. And so I say, look, maybe you're just conflating AGI with AGI plus emotional agent. As long as they have the GI bit without the emotional bit, they're not going to face these kinds of existential choices. And so capacity for freedom is more than just a kind of intellectual capacity roughly akin to mathematical calculation.
So that's a really good question, and raises all sorts of different kind of threads to pick up on. The first thing that I want to mention is that they are emotional, and that's part of what they're complicated. But the idea that they are creative choices, that's like the way we emphasize. The idea is that we are creating our own lives and who we're going to be as we make these choices. So they are different from math problems insofar as maybe math problems, you're trying to find the right solution. Here, you're not trying to find the right life for you, but you're trying to create a life. And then you might want a life that you're happy with, or you might want a life that fits other purposes or something of that sort. But the idea is that you're creating who you want to be as you make these choices. Can you have AGI that doesn't do that, right? And I think our argument is no, because that would require not being able to question these deeply held values and so on. And so while you can have something that is helpful as a tool in various domains, what you want is, let's say, something that is able to tell you, here's what you should do, or something that is able to say for itself, here's what I should do, then it will need to be able to reflect on what are those basic values. And then the other thread from your question is about emotions. I do think that emotions play a big role in our psychology and in our thinking about our values and the kinds of lives we want to live and so on. But some of the issues would arise, I think, even without the emotions. So imagine that you had the Roomba that Justin was talking about, trying to decide whether to continue to sweep floors or whatever over the next few years. And the idea is that you could imagine it trying to make a decision as to whether that's the life it wants to have or not, or something of that sort. And even if there are no emotions, that might also be something that it will need to decide, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering now about to what extent is that capacity to step back from given desires, given programs, whatever. To what extent is that capacity solely a function of our intellect as opposed to other aspects of our mental lives, like our emotional lives? I guess the argument is something like this. If you think that it's not just an intellectual capacity, but also an emotional capacity that gives us the ability to step back, because maybe if you don't have the right emotional capacity, you don't even have the motivation to step back and ask, hey, is this the way things should go, or should I do something else? So I suppose I'm beginning to think or entertain the idea that it's not a mere intellectual capacity by virtue of which we step back and reevaluate the given, but it's intellectual plus, let's just say, emotional capacity that gives us that kind of capacity to step back from the given. And if AGI is just the intellect and not the emotional capacities as well, it's not going to have the ability to step back. The Roomba might, in some sense, have the sort of the intellectual side of things all put in place to step back and ask, do I want to sweep or vacuum, whatever it does for the next 10 years? But it won't do that, or it can't do that because it lacks the emotional side as well.
I have one line of response. So I think what you're pressing is good objection to our view, because the objection would say, no, what you've put your finger on, Justin, it's not an obstacle to intelligence. It's not something that's needed for intelligence. You can still have AGI just without that emotional capacity. Be missing something, but not intelligent. One way we try and argue against it is, I'll be brief on this, but I'll talk about, there's this in discussions of AI safety and in value alignment. One example that's really taken off is this idea of a paperclip maximum. And the idea is supposed to be like, oh, we're building an AI, maybe super intelligent AI, and we give it just this one function that seems so ordinary or boring, just to make as many paper clips as could be in existence. And it seems that wouldn't pose a threat to us. But the argument, the original author, Nick Bostrom, was thinking about it, the way what he envisioned is, no, even as banal as that goal seems, if it really is super intelligent, it could make calculations like this. It could calculate, oh, the best way to make the most number of paper clips in the world is to kill all the people and just turn them into paper clips. Or it could make the following calculation. It could decide, look, as long as human beings are around, they could always potentially turn me off, and that would get in the way of maximizing paper clips. so I should preemptively kill them just so that I can't be turned off.
Sure.
And that way it's to maximize payment. So the point is supposed to be, again, there's these ways it's unforeseen that it's pursuing a goal that harms us, even though the goal itself does seem neutral with it. And anyway, in the paper, when we're discussing it, we're imagine you could walk up, talk to the paperclip maximizer and say, look, you are so super intelligent. You could be doing anything with your life. You could be writing like the greatest novel ever, or you could be curing cancer. What should you do? And the thought is this: if it really is just like perfectly decision theoretically rational, it's just rational in the sense of like maximizing the goals that it has, then it seems like the calculation is, no, I shouldn't write a novel, because if I write a novel, that gets in the way of maximizing paperclips, and I shouldn't cure cancer. And my point is supposed to be is that is, on the one hand, the answer that it seems like the paperclip maximizer imagining it would give you, because it really just is so good at maximizing its goal, and those things you're offering it are not ways to maximize the goal, so to rule it out.
Yeah, sure.
But if those are the responses it gives you, our thought is there's clearly
That's not
something
AGI.
intellectual that it's missing. Yeah, it's just too flat-footed. That doesn't seem like oppressively intelligent. Yeah, that's the thought. So that's why we think it's not just a matter of emotions, it's a matter of intelligence.
I guess another way of putting it is that thing is just a means-end reasoner. It reasons about the means to its end, and you cannot accurately capture what our intellect consists if the only thing you can say about it is that it's a means-end calculator.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'll add quickly, Reed, that it doesn't necessarily have to be an either or. Some people do think that rationality or intelligence requires emotions, right? And so in a sense, if that were true, then we could not create AGI that doesn't have any sort of emotional responses, right? Because the idea would be that emotions are required for intelligence to begin with. I don't necessarily think that we need to take a stand on that question, if that makes any sense. But I think what we do want to emphasize is that this capacity for existential choices is required for intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have to say no to the idea that emotions are required for existential choices. I think we can even grant that in a way. But if so, then we're not going to be able to create AGI unless there is.
Yeah. That's all really helpful. Let me say one last thing. I said it earlier, but I'll say it again just to see if I get a different response. I know that in some sense, I can choose something bananas, morally speaking, whatever it is. In some sense, I can choose to go kill people or whatever. But there's some more pragmatic sense in which it's just not on the menu for me. It's just not really. And I think there's probably many causes for why that stuff is not on the menu for me. There's going to be an evolutionary story to tell. There'll be a socialization story to tell about how I was raised. There'll be some various other kinds of stories to tell that different people will explain to me why that stuff is not really on the menu for me, even though technically speaking, there's not literally a physical barrier for me making those decisions. Nonetheless, it's not on the menu for these such and such causes. So take those such and such causes, put them into the AGI, and then the probability that the AGI is going to go bananas is no more probable than having a kid or than me doing those things. And so this would be to say that the value alignment, AI alignment project is not an attempt to give it values. It's an attempt to give it those things that the so-called average normal person has that makes it the case that killing humanity is not a viable option, not on the menu. That's what the new alignment project is. Make it like us, whether it's socialization plus some analog of evolution plus blah, 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 blah.
I think one quick thing to say is that obviously as humans take risks when it comes to that because some human beings do go on to do horrible things, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so there is some amount of risk. We don't know what kind of percentage it is.
Yeah.
And I think when people are concerned with existential risk, they're thinking about systems that will, in a way, be more powerful than us and so on. And then even if you have a small probability that it will be one of those few serial killers or something of that sort, if they had so much more power, then it would be a bigger risk. So I basically want to say, yeah, I think I agree. We should, if we're trying to create AGI, we should try to be like the equivalent of what we do with our kids, be as good parents as we can so that they will not grow up to be serial killers. But we can't guarantee that if we are creating AGI, because otherwise it won't be intelligent.
Yeah. This is great. So if I could summarize your view, if I have this right, it's something like AGI entails existentialist risk, and existentialist risk entails existential risk. And there's nowhere for alignment to get in between those entailments.
At least I think we don't see it. That's right.
Yeah. It's very cool. I love it. I need to think about it more, but I love it. It's great. Guys, thanks to both of you so much for coming on. This was really fascinating stuff. And here's to hoping that nobody gives AI freedom.
Thank you. It's been great to be on.
Thank you, Reid. It's really nice to talk to you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design a podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.